There's a moment in the life of a city when the policies meant to save it begin to accelerate its decline. Portland, Oregon may be living through exactly that moment right now. What started as an ambitious attempt to solve a housing crisis has evolved into something that is driving away the very people and businesses a city needs to survive. The vacancy tax, sold to Portland residents as a tool to force empty buildings back into productive use, is instead colliding with a commercial real estate market already on its knees, a downtown that has lost a significant share of its retail and office tenants, and a business community that has quietly begun making decisions about whether Oregon is still worth the cost. This is the story of how a well-intentioned policy instrument is interacting with forces far larger than any single city ordinance, and what the outcomes are telling us about the limits of taxing your way out of structural economic problems. Before we go further, I want to point something out. More than 90% of viewers watching these economic documentaries haven't subscribed yet. If you're interested in understanding what's really happening behind America's factory closures, corporate relocations, and job losses, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the deeper story behind the headlines. And while you're here, I'd like to know your opinion. Do you believe cities like Portland can reverse course before it's too late? Comment below. To understand what Portland is attempting, you have to understand what Portland became over the roughly 5 years preceding this policy debate. The city's downtown core, which once ranked among the more economically vibrant secondary urban centers in the American West, absorbed a series of compounding shocks that left visible scars across its commercial geography. The COVID-19 pandemic emptied office towers that were slow to refill. Retail anchors that had occupied prominent corner locations for decades quietly closed or relocated to suburban corridors, where their customer base had migrated. The protests and civil unrest of 2020, which drew national attention and lasted far longer in Portland than in most American cities, accelerated the departure of foot traffic that many small businesses depended on. And a prolonged debate over public safety, open drug use, and encampments in central business district areas left many property owners, employers, and residents concluding that the risk calculus had shifted against staying. The numbers that emerged from this period were not subtle. Downtown Portland's office vacancy rate climbed into territory that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Retail storefronts along corridors that once commanded premium rents sat dark behind plywood and paper. The Multnomah County office market, which encompasses Portland's central business district, saw vacancy figures push well above 25% by 2024, placing it among the most distressed major office markets in the entire country. Pioneer Place, the downtown mall that for years served as a commercial anchor and tourist draw, lost tenants steadily. Nordstrom, one of the most recognizable names in American retail, closed its downtown Portland location. The decisions kept coming, each one generating headlines, each one reinforcing the perception among potential investors and employers that downtown Portland had become a place businesses left rather than entered. Into this environment, Portland's city government began advancing the concept of a vacancy tax. The underlying logic was straightforward and, taken in isolation, not unreasonable. If buildings are sitting empty, and if that emptiness is contributing to blight, lost tax revenue, and reduced urban vitality, then imposing a financial cost on vacancy creates an incentive for property owners to either put their buildings to productive use or sell them to someone who will. The policy had precedents in other cities and countries. Vancouver, British Columbia had implemented a vacancy tax on residential properties and pointed to results that suggested it could move the needle on availability. San Francisco had explored similar mechanisms. The academic literature on vacancy taxes offered at least some support for the idea that holding costs could shift owner behavior. Portland's version, which moved through city council deliberations and attracted significant public attention, targeted commercial properties sitting vacant above defined thresholds. Property owners who left commercial space empty beyond a set period would face annual tax assessments designed to make indefinite vacancy financially painful. Supporters argued that the policy would unlock hundreds of thousands of square feet of dormant space, return ground floor retail to life, and generate revenue that could be directed toward housing and community programs. The coalition behind the measure included housing advocates, neighborhood organizations, and progressive city council members who argued that the status quo of empty buildings and struggling streets was itself a form of harm that justified policy intervention. The opposition came from multiple directions and raised arguments that, in retrospect, deserve careful examination. Commercial real estate owners and their representatives argued that the vacancy tax fundamentally misdiagnosed the problem. Buildings were not sitting empty because owners preferred vacancy. They were sitting empty because the demand was not there. Tenants had left Portland's downtown for reasons that had nothing to do with landlord behavior and everything to do with the conditions on the ground. Office workers were not returning to buildings in numbers sufficient to justify leasing. Retailers could not make the economics work when foot traffic had collapsed and theft and security costs had climbed. Penalizing owners for market conditions they did not create, the argument went, would not conjure demand that did not exist. It would simply add a cost layer to an already distressed asset class and accelerate the departure of capital from the city. That argument carries more weight when you examine what was actually driving the vacancy. Portland's downtown pedestrian counts, tracked by the Portland Business Alliance and independent researchers, showed foot traffic running well below pre-pandemic baselines, even years after restrictions had lifted. Hotel occupancy in the central city, a reliable indicator of overall urban vitality, remained soft. Convention bookings, which generate cascading economic activity through hotels, restaurants, and retail, had not fully recovered. Remote work arrangements had permanently altered the daily rhythm that once filled downtown streets between 7 in the morning and 7 at night. The workers who used to grab coffee, pick up lunch, run errands, and occasionally shop after work were simply not present in the numbers that had previously made ground floor retail viable. The structural shift in office demand deserves its own analysis because it sits beneath almost every other problem Portland's vacancy tax is trying to address. The American office market underwent a transformation during and after the pandemic that no municipal tax policy can reverse. Major employers across technology, finance, professional services, and media either reduced their physical footprint, shifted to hybrid schedules, or both. The consequence was that the amount of office space required per employee fell significantly, and that reduction showed up as vacancy in markets across the country. Portland was not unique in experiencing this. San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. all reported elevated office vacancy figures in the same period. What made Portland's situation more acute was that it entered the pandemic with a downtown already showing early signs of strain, and the combination of market forces and local conditions produced a vacancy rate that was among the highest of any comparable American city. When the vacancy tax proposal entered serious discussion, property owners began running the numbers in ways that produced outcomes the policy's designers had not fully anticipated. For some owners, particularly those holding older commercial buildings that would require substantial capital investment to modernize for current tenant expectations, the tax created a calculation that pointed toward disposal rather than renovation. If a building cannot attract tenants at rents sufficient to justify the renovation cost, and if holding it vacant now triggers an annual tax assessment on top of existing property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs, the rational response for some owners is to sell, often at a significant discount to assessed value. That distressed selling pressure, when it aggregates across a market, produces its own consequences. It signals to outside investors that the market is impaired. It reduces the tax base as assessed values fall to meet transaction prices. And it can accelerate the visual deterioration of the urban environment as buildings change hands in distressed conditions, and new owners take time to develop and execute plans. The interaction between the vacancy tax proposal and Portland's broader fiscal situation added another dimension that critics were quick to identify. Oregon's property tax system, shaped by a ballot measure passed in 1997 that limited annual assessed value growth, already constrained the city's ability to capture revenue from rising market values. Portland's general fund had faced persistent pressure, contributing to service reductions and budget debates that themselves affected the quality of the urban environment the city was trying to improve. The vacancy tax was partially framed as a revenue solution, but the math was complicated by the fact that a successful vacancy tax, one that actually moved owners to fill their buildings, would, by definition, reduce the tax base it was supposed to generate. If every vacant building suddenly found a tenant, the tax would produce nothing. If buildings remained vacant despite the tax, it suggested the underlying demand problem had not been solved, and the revenue collected came at the cost of continued deterioration. The business community's response to Portland's direction over this period was not primarily expressed through public statements. It was expressed through location decisions. Companies reconsidering their Pacific Northwest footprint were looking at a comparison set that included not just Portland, but Seattle, Boise, Salt Lake City, and a range of secondary markets in states with different tax and regulatory profiles. Oregon's personal income tax rate, which reaches 9.9% at the top bracket, is among the highest in the country. The state has no sales tax, which its supporters argue makes it more competitive for lower-income residents, but which also means the revenue system relies heavily on income and business taxes that compound the cost of operating there. When executives at companies with the flexibility to choose their location ran cost comparisons, Oregon's tax structure consistently appeared in the liability column. The population data that emerged through 2024 and into 2025 added quantitative weight to what had previously been anecdotal. Portland's metropolitan area, which had grown steadily through most of the 2000s, saw that growth stall and, in some measures, reverse. Multnomah County recorded net domestic outmigration, meaning more people left for other parts of the United States than arrived from them. The people leaving skewed toward working-age adults with the economic means to make a choice, exactly the demographic a city needs to retain in order to support the tax base, fill the workforce, and generate the consumer demand that keeps businesses viable. The people arriving included a higher proportion of individuals with lower incomes and greater service needs, a demographic shift that increases the demand for city services at precisely the moment when the revenue base to fund those services is under pressure. The retail picture downtown reinforced the vacancy tax's fundamental challenge. Even where property owners were willing to offer deeply discounted rents, and in some cases near-zero rents for short-term activations, they were finding limited interest from retailers capable of sustaining a long-term presence. The economics of brick-and-mortar retail in a downtown environment depend on a sufficient volume of daily foot traffic to generate the sales that justify the operating costs. Without the office workers, the tourists, the conventioneers, and the residents who once animated Portland's central streets, the revenue side of a retailer's model does not reach break-even, regardless of what the landlord charges for space. A vacancy tax can make an empty building more expensive to hold, but it cannot manufacture the customer base that would make filling it rational for a prospective tenant. There is a version of Portland's story that its supporters tell, and it is not without substance. The city remains a genuine center of creative industries, outdoor recreation culture, and food and beverage innovation. Its universities produce graduates who, in better conditions, would form the foundation of a knowledge economy workforce. The physical infrastructure of its neighborhoods outside the downtown core, the residential streets, the parks, the transit network, remains functional and, in many areas, genuinely attractive. New business registrations have not collapsed entirely, and there are pockets of commercial activity in inner East Side neighborhoods and along certain corridor streets that suggest the city's entrepreneurial energy has not disappeared, but simply relocated within its own geography. Those are real assets, but they are assets that operate in a context shaped by the decisions that continue to accumulate at the policy level. Every business that quietly redirects its expansion to a suburban campus rather than a downtown location. Every employee who chooses the Boise or the Salt Lake City offer over the Portland one. Every property owner who concludes that the vacancy tax represents one burden too many and sells into a declining market. These are individually small decisions that, in aggregate, define what a city becomes over a decade. Portland is not in a death spiral, but it is in a period of structural adjustment whose direction remains genuinely uncertain. And the vacancy tax, whatever its merits as a concept, is operating in an environment where the forces driving vacancy are not primarily within the reach of any single municipal policy instrument. The workers and small business owners who remain in Portland's downtown are living with the outcome of an equation they did not write. The property owners holding empty buildings are caught between market conditions that make filling them difficult and a policy that makes leaving them empty costly. The city government is attempting to use the tools available to it to address a problem whose roots extend far beyond the authority of any city council. And outside observers watching the experiment are drawing conclusions that will inform how other cities approach similar problems as commercial real estate markets in American downtowns continue to work through the consequences of the most significant shift in office and retail demand in a generation. What is happening in Portland is not just a Portland story. It is one clear and visible data point in a much larger reckoning with what American cities are for, who they are built around, and whether the policy instruments cities reach for in moments of crisis are matched to the actual scale and nature of the forces they are trying to address. Before you leave, I want to thank you for watching this report all the way through. But I also want to remind you that over 90% of viewers still haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these in-depth stories about economic change, business decisions, and the industries reshaping America, please hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel continue growing. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think more cities will follow Portland's path in the coming years? Let me know in the comments below.